Welcome to the 33rd episode of Speaking of Poetry. I am Rennie McQuilkin, Connecticut's Poet Laureate and also Simsbury's, and I am delighted to present bi-monthly readings by some of the area's finest poets. Today I am pleased to be joined by Harper Follansbee Jr., whose book of poems entitled In the Aftermath of Grief has just been published by Antrim House. Harper grew up on the campus of Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, where I knew him as a toddler. In 1971, he graduated from Trinity College in Hartford with a BA in English. Before deciding on a career in education, he worked as a carpenter's helper, painter, farmhand, mill hand, and greenhouseman in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont. He get around. He began his teaching career at the Rivers School in Weston, Massachusetts, where for 19 years he served as an administrator, middle and high school English teacher, coach, and advisor. More recently, Harper taught English at the Kingswood Oxford Middle School in West Hartford, retiring from that position after 15 years. Presently, he composes poems and grammar exercises, tutors students in writing, and leads summer creative writing workshops at Camp KO on the campus of Kingswood, Oxford. He lives with his wife, Harriet, and youngest son, Harper, in Windsor, Connecticut. Welcome to Speaking of Poetry, Harper Follansbee.
Thank you, Rennie.
Indeed.
It's wonderful to be here. This poem is about my editor and publisher, Rennie McQuilkin, and it's dedicated to him, and it's called One Magnificent Simile, and it has nothing to do with his age. In Sonnet 18, William Shakespeare claims that he can make his beloved immortal by comparing her to a summer's day in a poem that will last forever. Pure egotism, but he did it. Of course, I didn't appreciate my editor's suggestion for ending a poem I had treasured for years. He lopped off the last 3 lines, recommending a verb and an adverb writ large in the midst of a line I would never use. As an alternative, I devised a clever allusion to the Wizard of Oz, blathering through a microphone from behind his gold-hemmed green curtain about the excellence of my poem. My editor vetoed that. Finally, I conceived of a magnificent simile comparing my poem to a burner scrawled across a pristine wall. A burner being an elaborate piece of graffiti so vibrant it burns itself right off the wall. While my poem is all of that and more, the simile didn't fit with the rest of the poem, so I vetoed it myself and placed it here. My editor was right. I wonder if he worked with will. The next poem is called Recreation, and I think I got the inspiration from it from teaching John Steinbeck's The Pearl, and you'll see the connection, although the themes in the novel and the poem are very different. Recreation. When I write a poem, I become a pearl lodged in the flesh of an oyster, bathed in the warm waters off the coast of some remote isle. When I write a poem, I become the skin of those waters, smooth as the sky, stretched taut like some hot blue canvas, gently rocking to the swells that rise beneath some fisherman's boat. When I write a poem, I become the wind burrowing into the face of a cliff that looms above those swells, carving out a space for eagles to nest. When I write a poem, I become a grain of sand dislodged by the wind, carried out to sea where I bathe once again, buoyed by the tides, waiting for some oyster to open its goddamn mouth. The Skeleton. And it's a poem about how I missed my father when I was younger because he was too busy teaching. The Skeleton. In his classroom, my father hung a huge skeleton made of real bones, all strung together by hooks and wires. I would visit him sometimes after school, and I would touch the bones and wonder whose they were. Sometimes I would push the pelvis or the rib cage, and the bones would gyrate in a weird sort of dance, and I would smile and push again. Sometimes I would stare into the empty sockets, imagining eyes staring back. Perhaps some student who succumbed to the stench of formaldehyde or courted death by dissecting his own thumb, or a child weary of loneliness looking for a wink and a smile. The next poem is also about my father and me, and it's actually how I got his attention on an August afternoon. It's called Shooting Out the Lights. Shooting out the lights. On a hot, empty August afternoon during the summer I was 12, I took my pellet gun from the corner of my closet and went outside into the yard. The air was still and vacant, and I swear I could hear the pitch from the pines surrounding the house faintly sizzle and drip down the sides of their trunks like bacon fat off a hot griddle, and the smell of the pitch filled my nostrils and bit at my tongue. The doors to the garage at the edge of the yard stood open, and the Plymouth my father drove to work was gone. I squinted as I moved from the sun's glare into the shadows, cinders crunching beneath the soles of my sneakers, echoing in the dry silence. I propped my gun against the back wall and sat down, leaning my spine against the hard, rough boards. Through the doors, I looked out across the yard at the still pines, listening to the buzz and knock of a solitary fly bumping against the panes of glass in one of the windows on either side of the garage. Occasionally, I would imagine a branch lifting and falling in the air as if some giant were lying on his back beneath it, breathing gently into the thick green mat of its needles, inhaling and exhaling. Once I pushed the gun up against my shoulder, sighting down its length at the spot just below the breathing, and pulled the trigger. Once I took an idle shot at the innocent fly. Finally, I stood, pulling the doors shut so the sunlight shone dimly through the windows alone, and counted as I pulled the trigger 32 times in a row, one for each pane, as glass sprinkled across the dry floor like rain. After I opened the doors, letting the light back in, I left the gun leaning against the wall just below one of the windows where I knew my father would find it when he got home, and went to wait in my room. From there, I would see him frowning, a look of disappointment tugging his mouth into a straight line, his teeth clenching against themselves as he slowly hefted the gun in his large and powerful hands, anger gripping its stock. This poem is about my wife, and she claims to have nothing to do with it in terms of its inspiration, but I beg to differ. The poem is entitled Her Sky. Raised by the sea, she has always loved the sky, the way on cloudy days it sometimes folds itself against itself like furrows in a new plowed field. The clouds, I mean, her face uplifted as they push each other towards horizon's gaping door, or float aimlessly as children coming home from school. Far from shores where waves assume their color from on high, she wanders over meadows or up the sides of hills. She's not looking for an ocean. Clouds enough will do. Their white billowed towers propping heaven's dome, and I, who watch in wonder at her side, take comfort from each and every sigh that passes from her lips or widening in her eye. Look, she whispers, glancing upwards through the trees. Just look at the sky. And I do. The next poem is the title poem of the book. It's called In the Aftermath of Grief, and it's partly autobiographical, but it's also partly not. In the aftermath of grief, a man once told his wife he would rather publish a poem than father a child. The couple had married later in life, and the prospect of children frightened the man. Nevertheless, his wife bore him a daughter and a son, while his unpublished poems collected in yellowing piles on the tables and chairs of the house. After the birth of their son, the man temporarily stopped writing to change diapers and read books with cardboard pages and pictures of farm animals and insects and bears. Lying on the floor watching the boy wind the jack-in-the-box with one toe, or chew on the stuffed shank of Peter Rabbit, or crawl lickety-split down the carpeted hall, the man stretched the cartilage in both of his knees until his bones clicked in their joints and his knees ached when he slept. Their infant daughter had died of some long word they both chose to forget. The man tried to write his way out of the pain in poems that sounded like somebody beating the walls of a small room with a rubber mallet wrapped in a wet towel. He hollered at God as he drove downtown in some silly errand and shook his fist at the idiot stopped at the intersection in the blue Ford sedan with tinted glass. Eventually, he stowed his anger in the closet along with their daughter's effects, locked up tight in one of those plastic file boxes he had purchased at an office supply store. Then one day, the piles of poems began to diminish. The table and chairs no longer sagged with their weight. The man began to crawl more quickly down the hall after his son, and his sadness began to seep out from the edges of the house. The man learned to enjoy the way the boy teased his mother by crawling in the other direction when she called his name. She laughed as she chased him about the house, and the boy giggled as if someone were tickling him. On the first warm day of spring, the boy's mother threw open the windows of the house, and a gentle breeze blew the scent of lilacs into every room. The breeze scattered his father's poems across the floor, and the boy crawled over them as he scurried about, playing hide and seek with his mother. Because he liked the sound, the boy would occasionally crumple a few poems in his tiny hands while he waited for his mother to appear. At the end of the day, pretending not to notice what they were, she would throw the crumpled pieces of paper away. The boy's father never asked where his poems had gone. He only noticed as the piles dwindled, his spirit soared, and he began to laugh and giggle with his wife and child. Then one day he stopped writing altogether, and what was left of the piles and most of the contents of the plastic file box vanished into thin air, just like that. It was the boy rummaging in the back of the closet who eventually found the picture. He held it above his head in both hands, calling out in a loud voice as he always did when he wanted to show his parents something he had discovered about the world. His parents told him the baby in the picture was his sister. They told him she looked almost exactly like him. Then they framed the picture and put it downstairs on the piano where his mother's music carried the sound of their daughter's face into every room of the house. The next poem is about that boy, and it's entitled The Orator. Early as the dogs scavenge for Cheerios beneath our son's high chair, my wife and I prepare the day. In the gray moments before dawn, he lectures the light switch, the wallpaper, and the chandelier. Stretching his arms above his head, he exhorts the household gods to grant our world one more jubilant hour. After Watching is a poem. You have to have seen the movie A Year of Living Dangerously to fully understand it. It's about a night when I was watching the movie, and also I took my son to a dance and then went and picked him up. This was a high school dance, and this is my older son. After Watching. After watching another movie about misguided expatriates, you know, the one with Mel Gibson as the Australian reporter, Sigourney Weaver as the British attaché, and Linda, not Helen Hunt, as the androgynous narrator who's in love with them both. I go to pick up my son from a high school dance. The sky is dark, dark blue, so close to black you can easily mistake one for the other, and the clouds are like tufts of cotton candy that someone has pasted onto its dome. They look so pink in the cold blue blackness you can almost taste them, and for a moment I pretend it's summer and I'm walking along the midway of some county fair with the missus, and the moon is so bright and full I have to squint to look up at its shine. Then I remember Sukarno's sunglasses and the heat of Jakarta, and all of a sudden it's winter again with the wind chill knocking the temperature down into the teens, and I'm shivering in my parka while the station wagon struggles to warm its brittle old bones. This poem is entitled Last Class. I spent 34 years as a teacher, both in high school and middle school, and this particular class is occurring late in the afternoon, back in an era when we still had blackboards and chalk and erasers, and there was a certain amount of dust always in the air. Last class. The clock above the blackboard ticks the afternoon away like a meter maid, handing out tickets to tourists who have parked on the wrong side of the street. The penalty for wasting her time is 2 days in jail or a $50 fine, she sneers, as you assure her you're not from the south of France, just over for the day from Piscataway. She's no patriot, time's handmaiden. She owes no fealty to you and your ilk as you sit suspended in a sunlit haze of chalk, listening to the heat rise and the radiator's tick mimic the sound of the clock interrupting your train of thought, which is pulled off on a siding just now, unloading a boxcar of answers to questions someone else has devised. One day in the winter, I was writing in my study, and I looked up, and there were 2 deer in our backyard. And this is the poem that followed them as they moved around the yard. 2 deer in the yard. Nonchalant as a gentleman savoring his meal, an enormous buck with a head full of horns is grazing just down the slope in a small grove of hemlock, pulling at branches and sampling the greens. His son, browsing nearby, stretches out his tawny neck to nibble a plate of escarole and endive. If these 2 were goats, they would know nothing of haute cuisine, and I would board them in a shed at the edge of our yard so they could mow the lawn and prune the hedge. As it is, their taste runs to escargot and caviar. In winter, they survive on hors d'oeuvres alone, hemlock and yews that border the drive. The 2 of them serve no purpose beyond this picturesque scene, the snow sifting down through the trees, catching on their coats as they dine, each flake melting to the shape of a glistening jewel, till the weight of the mix, droplets and flakes, causes one or the other, father or son, to shudder and shake. The fur down his spine, droplets explode, shatter the air. The next poem is entitled The River, and I wrote it after taking a trip down the Farmington River in my kayak. And I remember that particular day the Farmington was low, and I had to pull my kayak at times, but as a result, I really got to see the river in much more detail than I would have had I just been gliding by. The river. Every spring, the river widens, breathing water through its gills as it careens downstream like some enormous primordial eel bent on reaching her mate. The layers of soil on either shore have surrendered so often they have forgotten they are not a part of the monster's belly. Instead of the trough, she slithers down on her way to meet the sea. Gliding across the lazy waters of a hot August afternoon, I note the posture of the trees, which tilt like timbers of some toppled church whose congregation has long since fled. Their roots, gnarled like the swollen fingers of arthritic old maids accepting their fate, clutch at the feathery soil which slips their grasp without complaint. Still, no matter what the angle of each trunk's slow decline, the leaves on its branches shiver in the breeze that skitters across the water, flashing their pale undersides, as if to say, this surrender will not be their last. The next poem is entitled On a Hill in New Hampshire, and really putting the New Hampshire on the end of it isn't absolutely necessary because I live on a hill now in Connecticut, and my parents owned a house in New Hampshire that they retired to. I think we owned it for about 50 years, and it probably was the first hill in my life. And so when I remember hills, I remember it. But I also have rolled pumpkins down our present hill, so it connects very definitely with this poem. On a hill in New Hampshire, I've always lived on a hill, sharing summer's high grass with crickets, field mice, and garter snakes curled on the cool stones of a foundation or chasing each other in the walls at night, interrupting news reports of Himalayan paratroopers landing on the back 40, all set to invade Massachusetts from the north, capturing thousands of flatlanders who wouldn't know a sand dune from the summit of the missing eyebrow on the old man's missing face. Farmers left these hills pushing west at least as far as the river that splits New Hampshire off from Vermont, like one block of quarried granite from another. Alluvial waters creeping downstream looking for a mouth. What grows here gets blown by the wind or dropped by birds, not sown deliberately in rows. Something haphazard loves a hill. It lands and sticks and thrives. Apples maybe or a pear, but even they will drop when someone shakes a bough. Anything hard rolls downhill. Anything soft stays put. Pumpkins, hoops, and wooden barrels roll. Pillows, zinnias, and you remain. I'm going to read a couple of new poems now to finish up the program. The first one is called Global Warming. It's been one of those springs everyone hates. Just enough sun to make people who live for lying on the beach believe it's summer in May, at least until the rains arrive, dashing their hopes as the clouds hang low for days. By June, the vegetation has taken over and the worshippers of Ra wish they could turn on the AC, a sure sign summer has arrived, so they could head for the coast top down and music blaring. But the damn rain just won't quit as basements flood, mildew spreads like measles, and merchants shake their heads the way they did last winter after all that snow. Polar bears have abandoned the North Pole and are walking the streets of New York, interlopers from some ancient northern realm where cathedrals were built in the shape of icebergs, each with its own rose window portraying Odin, Fjorgen, and Thor in various stages of repose. The bears are gentle creatures that prefer everything they drink on the rocks and frequent sushi bars where they carefully disassemble their meals, leaving trails of rice littering the floor as they depart the premises. During the day, they collect in air-conditioned lobbies of banks and businesses, hoping a new ice age will descend through elevator shafts, serving as conduits from their frozen version of heaven to a new land of ice flows and dams where seals wait patiently on sheets of ice in the East River like canapes at a cocktail party. During the night, the bears loll in the Central Park Reservoir, looming above the water like gigantic ghosts. The recent deluge has made the water much cooler, but nothing so cold as the North Pole, even with the ice cap gone. The influx of bears has caused tourists to flock to New York, as if it were some sort of urban Yellowstone. No incidents have been reported yet as the bears carry tranquilizer guns and laminated permits swinging around their necks, allowing them to move unfettered about the 5 boroughs. A real estate tycoon running for office and posing as an environmentalist has contracted with all the sushi bars in the city to supply each bear with a weekly tab, but the unrelenting rains continue and the beaches remain empty while restaurants all along the eastern shore from Long Island Sound to the Bay of Fundy have closed their doors. Merchants from Manhattan to New Brunswick shake their heads in bewilderment, muttering, "It's just one of those springs." The semantics of surrender. As I sit on the front lawn on a morning late in May and look out at the trees dressed in their eager new leaves and flowers and shrubs bursting and full of themselves, I ponder pruning and mowing and cutting the brush in the field, to say nothing of uprooting the morning glories the previous owner allowed to run rampant, the woodbine and mare's tail, American bittersweet, honeysuckle, mugwort, and creeping Charlie, their names so endearing, I hesitate to defend decades of cultivation against their burgeoning hordes, set to ascend the front wall like Germanic tribes poised to conquer Rome. Let them come, I say, from my perch peering down the hill at May-apples and daylilies, bull thistle, wild raspberry, and cinnamon fern. They can have the place, this citadel where I have labored so long to keep them at bay, the lawn and gardens edged against the invasion of crabgrass in August, or chickweed, common purslane, spotted spurge, and hairy galansaga, staging an early onslaught in June. What's here they could possibly want, I wonder, looking up through the branches of a black walnut towards the sky, listening to the song of a mourning dove serenading his mate. Such a sad soliloquy, signaling the beginning of life, not its end.
Harper, that was such a splendid reading. It's going to sustain me through the evening and on in tomorrow and for many days hence. I loved getting roasted at the beginning and saved at the very end, fortunately. The way that your reading went through the energies of childhood, some of them more destructive than others, some of them more sad than others, on into that the beautiful love poem for Harriet, and then the middle poem, the title poem, with its terrific emotion, its terrible slough of despond, and then its beautiful ending in which the world is new and fresh and possible again. And then to some poems I didn't know all of, a couple of the ones at the end, the beautiful poems about the natural world, the river, and the polar bears waiting for the ice age to descend through elevator shafts from the North Pole, and the weeds invading your world, but being forgiven for their temerity. Such a gorgeous reading. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And thanks also to Ken Picard and Karen Handville, who make this program possible. If you would like to learn more about Harper Follansbee's poetry and read samples from his book, please visit the Antrim House website, antrimhousebooks.com. You may also be interested in other Antrim House poets whose lives and works are described on the website. Goodbye for now until we meet again next month for the 34th installment of Speaking of Poetry.